Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. My name is Chris Paxson. I'm president of Brown University, and I am delighted to welcome you to the 97th Stephen A. Ogden Jr. Class of 1960 Memorial Lecture on International Affairs. The Ogden Lectures is one of Brown's most distinguished lecture series, one of the oldest lecture series. And since the first lecture in 1965, the university has welcomed heads of state, senior diplomats, senators, prime ministers, prominent journalists, and others. And they've spoken from personal experience about pressing global issues. The lectures were established as a memorial to Stephen A. Ogden Jr. He was a member of the Brown class of 1960, and sadly he passed away during his junior year. And the lectures just reflect his dream of promoting international peace through a career in international relations, which sadly he never got to fulfill. So today it's my distinct honor to introduce our Ogden lecturer, the former governor of Florida, 2016 presidential candidate, and member of one of America's most prominent political families, Jeb Bush. Before I introduce the governor, I want to offer our heartfelt condolences on behalf of the entire Brown family for the passing of the family matriarch, Barbara Bush. Saturday's beautiful funeral service for your mom was notable for its dignity and its civility and its grace, and these are virtues that I think many of us remember her by. Governor Bush in his eulogy reminded us of the centrality of family, eloquently noting that of his mother that, quote, she was our teacher and role model on how to live a life with purpose and meaning, something we talk a lot about at Brown. The lessons Barbara Bush imparted to her children were, quote, be kind, always tell the truth, never disparage anyone, serve others, treat everyone as you will want to be treated, and love your God with your heart and soul. So worth noting and worth thinking about. So back to the governor. Son of one president, brother of another president, Jeb Bush once famously declared himself to be his, quote, own man in response to suggestions that the last name he shares with George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush would likely frame his thinking as a policymaker. And in his public life, he's defied that expectation and in many ways has written his own script on some issues while echoing the family legacy on some other issues. As the former Commerce Secretary and two-term governor of Florida, one of America's most internationally oriented states, Governor Bush has long touted wise engagement in world affairs that serve the causes of global peace and prosperity and security and human freedom. A proponent of free trade, for example, he backed regional pacts like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Trade, he noticed during his 2016 presidential campaign, quote, is essential to creating the sustained high growth that we need to create well-paying jobs and new opportunities for American farmers and businesses. Among the governor's signature issues is one that today remains largely unresolved and is, from where we sit here in higher education, one that we talk a lot about, it's critically important, and that's the issue of immigration. He has called multiculturalism one of America's greatest strengths, and in his book, Immigration Wars, Forging an American Solution, he wrote that, and I quote, when immigration policy is working, it's like a hydroelectric dam, a sturdy wall whose valves allow torrents of water to pour through, creating massive amounts of dynamic energy. This recognition of how immigration enriches American life is in line with positions he's taken over the years that sometimes run counter to Republican Party orthodoxy. Placing the importance of family at the center of his thinking on immigration issues, he supported a pathway to legal status for 11 million unauthorized immigrants and citizenship eligibility for the Dreamers, 800,000 undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children. In education, he's known as a reformer during his time in office, enacting pioneering changes that are rooted in conservative principles, such as greater school accountability, an increased emphasis on testing, expansion of charter schools and school choice, and notably, he spearheaded passage of the nation's first statewide school voucher program, a development that has since sparked similar efforts in several other states. And today, of course, this remains a staple issue of national conversation. So beyond his service as an elected official, Governor Bush has contributed much to the public good through his association with several not-for-profit organizations. He founded the Foundation for Florida's Future, which is a think tank dedicated to engaging grassroots citizen action in public policy making, and the Foundation for Excellence in Education. And he has, of course, supported the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy. So I know that I look forward, and I know we all do, to Governor Bush's presentation today. His talk is titled Leadership in a Changing World, and he will present some comments. We'll do a brief Q&A with me, but then I promise we'll leave lots of time to open it for Q&A with the audience. So with that, please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, President Paxson, and thank you for your kind introduction to be here at Brown. It is a delight to be here. Some people asked whether I would be here mourning the loss of my mom, and what I've told people is that she would kick my butt if I didn't show up for a commitment that I made. My dad, this love story my mom and dad have had over 73 years of marriage, 75 years together, is pretty moving, for at least for our family. And he went into the hospital literally 6 hours after the interment of my mom. And but the guy is stronger than an ox. He's back out of ICU, and hopefully will be leaving the hospital on Friday. So for those that believe in faith, I hope you'll pray for my dad. I am not objective about this. I am totally biased about it, but I believe he's the greatest man alive, and I want him to stay alive for a little bit longer. So I'm going to call an audible here. This distinguished lecture series relates to international affairs. I'm going to make the argument that the most powerful thing that we can do as a nation to project American values around the world and to create a safe and secure world is for every American to have the chance to rise up. Every American, no matter where they start in life, to have a chance to be successful, to live purposeful lives, because that's now at risk. And I don't believe that the United States can maintain its presence in the world in a meaningful way unless we deal with this issue that most people talk about in terms of income inequality. I would argue that the larger issue is the lack of social and economic mobility. And I want to start my remarks with a quote from a book written by Candace Millard called Destiny of the Republic. And for those book readers out there, I recommend this book. It's a book about James Garfield, a little-known president in our country's past, who was an extraordinary man living in an extraordinary time. And this is his quote from that book. "There is no horizontal stratification of society in the country like the rocks in the earth that holds one class down below forevermore, and let another come to the surface to stay there forever. Our stratification is like the ocean, where every individual drop is free to move, and where from the sternest depths of the mighty deep, any drop may come up to glitter on the highest wave that rolls." Wow. If you love your country, and I know you do, if you believe in our country, that is a definition, that's an aspiration for a great country, where it doesn't matter where you start in life, that we're not in a stratified kind of society where if you're born poor, you stay poor, and if you're wealthy, you stay wealthy, and if you're in the middle, you just kind of stick there. That through your own efforts, you can earn success. And the dynamic interaction of all of us in pursuit of our own dreams creates huge opportunities, a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation, a lot of wealth, and a lot of benefits to mankind. Yet that eloquent description, that aspiration of America's promise now is being challenged in ways that hadn't existed not that long ago. The real issue is, can people rise up? And the question is increasingly, maybe not. And that should anger us. It should give us a sense of purpose about what we need to do to change it. The recent study that I've used, and I was told today by your chancellor that a Brown professor actually participated in this research with Raj Chetty, is a longitudinal study of measuring income of families over a long period of time, looking at tax returns. And Raj Chetty and his team at the National Bureau of Economic Research looked at people born in the 1940s and compared their lot in life with their parents. And what he found was 90% of them, in real terms, had greater prosperity, greater income than their parents. Fast forward to those born in 1980, and what we find now today is that only 50% of that cohort, of those people, have achieved or will achieve income levels higher than their parents. We're becoming sticky at the ends. And if you're born poor in this country, you're more likely to stay poor than any time in modern times. And if you're wealthy, things are great. Basically, you have more intact families. There's no crime in your communities. You get to go to schools that are phenomenal. Your children interact with other like-kind families, and you end up being marrying amongst yourself. You live in the super zip codes, and the net effect of all this is that we're becoming more like the rocks rather than the ocean. And the challenge of this is that we're now in an economy where the acceleration of technology will challenge mobility even more. When you combine the convergence of much of which is being developed here at Brown University and many other great universities, artificial intelligence, automation, big data analytics, 5G wireless technology that will be rolled out over the next few years, robotics, and the avalanche of disruption is attacking every element of every sector of our economy. According to McKinsey, 30% of all hours worked could be automated by 2030. So the world is not static, but yet we're becoming more stratified as a country, and you combine that with the simple fact is that we now have created a perpetual skills gap in this country that is quite dangerous. Government statistics show that there are 6 million jobs unfilled chronically. That doesn't change based on economic activity because the skills don't exist. Several years ago, Siemens decided to build a plant, a gas turbine plant in Charlotte, North Carolina, about 5 years ago, and 10,000 people showed up for 800 jobs. Fewer than 15% of the applicants could pass the reading, math, and writing screening test, which required a 9th grade level education. Social and economic mobility are necessary for the hope of a prosperous America, and a prosperous America, as I said, is one of the important things that we need to have from a national security perspective. If we don't get this right, the demands on government will overwhelm all of the long-term investment in infrastructure, research and development, building capacity for people. We'll be lessening our focus on that, and I think our national security interests will be different. So there are things that we can do, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, but clearly, as I look out and see younger people here, sometime in the very near future, we need to figure out that the social contract has to be adjusted to preserve and protect it for those that have it, but to recognize that there's at least a $50 trillion debt on the backs of the next generation. And it is shameful for people more or less my age to be able to leave that legacy for the next generation. We need entitlement reform. We need to rebuild our country from the bottom up. The concept of subsidiarity is a really powerful one. Strong families, vibrant communities, civic organizations, organizations of faith are an element of our past that have eroded dramatically. And it's really hard. That's the safety net that people have relied on in the past. And in a world of massive disruption, we need to renew that. In whatever form it takes, we need to renew it so that we can create a vibrant society. Tax reform, modernizing regulations, embracing the energy revolution, all of these things are important. And a commitment to long-term infrastructure certainly would be helpful for us to create a socially mobile and economically mobile country. But I'd like to talk about two other elements of this that relate to human capital, because at the end of the day, economic and social mobility is more about making sure that people have the capacity to achieve earned success. And that is comprehensive immigration reform, part of our American heritage, and secondly, a total transformation of how we educate and train from pre-K to life. Basically, if we could start from scratch, we would not have the systems that we have today. We would have a dramatically different system that would yield a far better result. Our legal immigration system has been part of our nation's success over 2 centuries. It's in our DNA. It's who we are. We're all immigrants, but for Native Americans in this country. Our citizenship is pretty unique as well. It's based, when we get it right, on a set of shared values, not race or ethnicity or some exclusionary belief. Done correctly, immigration can be a catalyst for sustained economic activity and for sustained innovation. And here's some facts that are probably worth knowing. The number of working-age American-born to U.S.-born parents will shrink by 8 million people between today and 2035. Families are being formed later in this country, and those families are having fewer children, and we're seeing an explosion. Now that I'm 65, I'm part of this problem, an explosion of people over the age of 65. By the way, filling out the godforsaken Medicare form, I don't wish that on anybody, but you're fined if you don't fill it out, which I find kind of crazy. Our demographic pyramid is inverting at warp speed, and it'll place huge burdens, as I said, on the next generation. Here's the deal. Immigrants are significantly younger, legal immigrants are significantly younger than native-born Americans. They form more families than native-born Americans. They have more children than native-born Americans. Legal immigrants have a higher workforce participation, and they form more businesses. Legal immigrants have founded more than half of the so-called unicorns formed in the United States. While comprising only 13% of the population, roughly a third of all the patents issued are owned by immigrants. To turn immigration policy into an economic driver and away from a political wedge issue that the left loves not to solve because they can win elections, and the right loves not to solve because it placates the right, I guess. To turn it into an economic driver, we need common sense suggestions on how we go about dealing with the rule of law first and foremost. That means border security. A great country needs to control its border, plain and simple. All countries have that obligation and duty, and there are simple ways that we could do this, getting beyond the symbolism of building a wall and making Mexico pay for it. You know, that ain't going to happen. That's not the issue at hand here. But we do need to control the border, and there's all sorts of GPS technology, drone technology, forward-leaning border patrol to make sure that there's a healthy deterrent where it is easier to come here legally than illegally. We need to deal with the simple fact is more than half of all of the undocumented people in this country came with a legal visa and overstayed their time. The notion that somehow there's a massive wave of people crossing our border is wrong. But it is true that people get a visa, and then instead of going back home, they overstay and they immerse themselves into whatever community it is. A great country ought to figure out where those folks are and deal with that issue. It means helping the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, where most of the undocumented people coming into this country are not coming from Mexico. They're coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and in Guatemala. Those countries desperately need an effort used with the private sector and the government of the United States to help them rebuild their economies and create a safe and secure place for their residents, for their citizens, so they're not pushed out of their country to take the perilous journey through Mexico to come to our country. It means a path to citizenship and a path to earn legal status for undocumented in our country. There is no possible way that we're going to deport 11 million people. There's a reality check at some point that needs to take place. The cost of that, the disruption of family life, is so un-American that we need to take a chill pill here and recognize that this is not the kind of thing that we need to do. And a path to legal status means that people earn their legal status in this country. And that, I think, is what most people want to do. They want to come out from the shadows. They want to be respected. They want to work. They want to provide for their family. And the United States, as a just country, should develop policies to make that happen. We need to narrow the number of people that come here by family reunification and expand the number of people that come here that can make an immediate economic contribution, or a long-term contribution for that matter. We're the only country in the world that has this broad definition of family, of spouse and minor children like every other country, and adult siblings and adult parents. The so-called chain migration comes when, as you cascade out, more and more people can bring more and more people in. No other country does this, and the net effect of this is they're not, the catalyst for economic prosperity and for mobility that's not the best policy for doing that. A country that is focused on using this as an economic strategy would narrow the number of people coming by family to what every other country has, and expanding the number of people based on need. There are huge shortages where if we could fill those shortages, investments would take place in our country rather than Asia or other places. Canada and Australia have a model for this. They have, for a country 1/10 of our size, Canada has more economic immigrants than we do. Which country is going to be the winner going forward? A country that doesn't see the potential benefit of people that dream big dreams to come to our country, that have skills to be able to make a difference, or the system that we've had that has not been able to change because of our political gridlock. One final point about immigration and why it's essential for our long-term success. It is only when we embrace a set of shared values that this works. The idea, Madam President, that we're a multicultural society, we're a diverse country for sure, but multiculturalism where there isn't a set of shared values leads to chaos and leads to problems. A diverse population where there's a set of shared values, which means that anybody coming to this country, and for that matter, people that were born here, need to understand our heritage, need to understand the Bill of Rights, need to understand the Constitution, need to understand, warts and all, our history. That's what ties us together. And my advocacy is that we should have civics education in every school all across this country, not to promote some brand of patriotism, but just to have a deeper understanding of the extraordinary nature of this country. It is a phenomenal country, and we shouldn't be ashamed of expressing it and making sure that every person in this country understands it, because today that's not the case. Down the road a bit, in another Ivy League school, the Annenberg Public Policy Center, they do these polling of people's understanding of our history, and only 40% of Americans polled by the Annenberg Center could recognize one right guaranteed by the First Amendment. And only 25% of Americans in the poll could say what the three branches of government are. Wow. How are we going to not be a place where there's a Tower of Babel, where everybody thinks differently and speaks differently and has no sense of shared identity, unless we fix that? And for immigration policy to work, I think that has to be the highest priority. The second thing we need to do is recognize the world we're living in is dramatically different than the education system that was designed in the early 20th century, and the organizational model is basically an industrial model that has been obliterated in our economy and our life. While our high school graduation rate has been rising, and that's a source of pride for educators and policymakers, I'm sure, and is now 83%, a little more than 1 in 3 students are truly college and or career ready. A third. More than half of entering community college students and 1 in 5 entering university students require remediation. In effect, they have to retake high school math and high school reading before they can start taking college work. And even fewer students are career ready because most of our K-12 education system is designed around a liberal arts notion that, you know, if you're a 4-year degrees, you get a psych major, English major, that the economy will absorb your skills and you'll be able to be successful. Well, that's at risk now. Are you an English major? No, joking. He was laughing. Yeah. Well, just as an aside, if you're an English major, you know how to think, and you know how to write, and you know how to read, you're going to have a huge advantage over the rest of your generation, so stick with it. A college education is still meaningful, and yet access to college is increasingly out of reach for many. The student debt has doubled in size in the last 5 years. It's over $1.2 trillion. I don't have to tell the young people here that are students, that's recourse debt. And only 60% of full-time students, it may be hard for people at Brown University to appreciate this, 60% of full-time students graduate with a 4-year degree in 6 years. These are the outcomes of a pre-K to 20 system that needs massive change. And here are some suggestions on how to go about it. My personal belief is there should be a focus on early childhood literacy. 4-year-olds need to be able, the gaps that start at an early age. A child that is in an intact family, a fluent intact family, has 10 times more, listens to 10 times more words, has a vocabulary exponentially higher than a child that is stuck in poverty. A great nation needs to recognize this and deal with it as early as possible. And it needs to be tied to a K-3 strategy, pre-K to 3. In third grade, if you haven't mastered the ability to read, then you're not going to be able to understand math and science and all the subjects that start in fourth grade when you're reading to learn rather than learning how to read. In Florida, we eliminated social promotion, this insidious idea that in third grade, if you're functionally illiterate, it's okay as a society to pass you on to the fourth grade. Who's fooling who? Every study, all the data suggests that that gap grows immediately to a point where they may have a piece of paper that says they're a high school graduate, but that piece of paper is increasingly meaningless. And it's not an easy thing to do politically to say you're going to be held back. In fact, our first year that we did it, something like 16% of all kids were held back in third grade in Florida. And it happened to be my re-election year. All the political advisors thought I was a complete idiot to do this, but the simple fact is we cut functional literacy rates in half in the state over a 2-year period alone. We put reading coaches in every school to teach teachers how to teach reading because the schools of education don't do it. We made sure that we allowed mentors into every school and turned this into a cultural value, if you will, that in Florida, literacy truly matters. And the net effect of this was that Florida, on that nation's report card test, the fourth grade reading test, went from 29th out of 31 in 1998 to 6th out of 50 in 10 years' time. And today, Florida is 5th in the country. And today, Florida's Hispanic kids on the fourth grade reading test and math test do better than the average of 38 states. You can move the needle if you make a comprehensive approach to this. It's just not early childhood learning that matters. It's tying it together with a comprehensive strategy to make sure that kids in fourth grade are beginning to learn. We need to empower parents, particularly low-income parents, to make choices for their children. Why do we think that this is such a radical idea? For the life of me, I don't get this. I know that, I got tire marks on my forehead. I know that people don't like this idea, but it's an American idea of being able to customize your life and to choose what you think is best for your kid. And I don't care if you provide information to turn a parent into an informed consumer, they'll make better choices 99% of the time than the bureaucracies that people seem to want to defend at all costs. Empowering parents, both public and private schools, creates a more dynamic, vital education system. Charters, magnets, virtual schools, dual enrollment, all sorts of ways to challenge the orthodoxy that somehow we're living in a world where 180 days is the organizational model because kids in the summer have to go make sure they can harvest the crops. And that the industrial model of bureaucracies on top of every school is the way to go. That's not how successful enterprises exist today. They're a bottom-up, more dynamic approach to this, and choice will allow that to happen at a greater pace. We need high standards and accountability and a recognition that the failure that we cloak over needs to stop. The NAEP test that I referred to shows that only 37% of 12th graders are proficient in reading and only 25% are proficient in math. And yet we have an 83% graduation rate for high school. Who's fooling who? If we're going to be successful going forward in this country, I think we need to challenge the orthodoxy of the economic interest of the adults being the dominant element of how we organize our schools. That means high standards and greater accountability means we need to have total transparency about how schools are doing and more choices for parents when they're not doing the best job. In Florida, we had this radical idea. We graded schools A, B, C, D, and F. Like people know an A is better than an F. And the net effect of that is we had fewer Fs and a lot more As. And we rewarded improvement by giving the schools $100 per student directly to them, unencumbered, no cuts by the bureaucracy. And the net effect was we had continuous improvement. When schools were failing, they brought in dynamic principals to be able to motivate the teachers to do a better job. We need to reward teachers because a great teacher will gain 1.5 years worth of knowledge for a child and a bad teacher probably a half a year. And so if you lose the lottery, you're 1 grade level behind in 1 year's time. And that happens all across this country. Great teachers should be rewarded so that they can stay in the classroom. Teachers that have mastery in subjects where there are very few teachers teaching should be paid more. Teachers that go into the tougher schools should be paid more. We should treat teachers as a profession, not some collective bargaining unit as though they're some unit, a widget in a production line. Teachers are essential for student learning, but the organizational model that we have today is obsolete in my mind. We need to personalize learning where learning is the constant and time is the variable. The whole system needs to be turned on its head. Imagine a system where like-aged kids go together up the learning system, but kids that are mastering the material quickly can move on to the next subject matters, and the kids that are struggling don't just get pushed along. They master it before they can move on to the next thing. That's a system that exists in Sweden, it exists in California and other places on the margins. It should be applied across the country. This should be a customized learning experience. Every child has a God-given ability. They learn differently. It seems to me that we could organize in a 21st century way around these students so every kid reaches their God-given potential. Career readiness is another element of this. There's easy ways to embed a career orientation into schooling. In Florida and other states now, nationally recognized certificates are embedded in high school learning so that you get a high school degree, you probably get college credit as well, and you have a piece of paper that actually is real. That means that you might be certified to work on Microsoft or Salesforce or other technological endeavors, or the trades or anything else. There are literally scores of these certificates that could be embedded in all sorts of classes, and that should be a high priority. And then finally, we need to strive to make sure that higher education is done at a lower cost and yields a better result. The 95% of the students that go to college are going to metropolitan state universities, in effect. They're going to public universities in those communities. And there needs to be a challenge of how they go about making sure that every child, every student that's going to college can get a 4-year degree in 4 years, that there's courses available, that there's enough counseling to make sure that their path is designed so that they can complete the work in a proper way. And then finally, I'd suggest that this needs to be lifelong. Our training programs were designed, most of them in the 1970s. It is totally ridiculous to think that we would keep training the way we did in 1970 for the world that we're moving towards. We need to customize the training experience as well, because there's going to be, in this disruptive world we're moving to, a lot of people that are going to need to get re-upped in terms of their skills. If we do those two things, I think the United States can get back on track and will be this dynamic, chaotic, crazy place that's going to yield more inspiration, more innovations, more creativity than any country in the world. But one of the last things that we need to do is to restore and change at least the toxic political environment that exists in our country. And there are a lot of great ideas. I embrace some, I don't embrace others. Term limits, Constitutional Convention of the States, taking money out of politics. Everybody kind of looks at these tactics as a means by which to deal with our political problems that we face. Frankly, we need to take a step back and recognize that politics is a mirror image of us. I don't want to offend anybody, but it is. It's embedded in our culture, and what we accept in terms of behavior of politicians is part of the challenge that we face. So I have a few rules. I'm calling them Jeb's rules until someone wants to steal them. 4 of them to maybe help begin the process of restoring a consensus orientation to our politics. Number 1, voters need to penalize rather than reward vulgar and toxic acts of discourse. It is shameful that politicians You're not riding a big horse, you're not the big dog if you disparage the disabled or call someone a Nazi. Throwing this language out only divides us. And it appeals to a very narrow base, and I'm sure it makes you feel good. That narrow base thinks you're really strong when you do it. But the great majority of Americans are decent, honorable people, and we need to stand up for decency and honor, or we'll never get to a point where we can move to a consensus. We can't forgive politicians on our team that do something ridiculous. You know, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of sick of watching someone's head explode about the foibles of someone on the other team, but yet when someone on your team does the exact same thing and you're totally silent, that's called hypocrisy in the real world, and we should not reward that. This tribalism that exists in politics today exists because we let it happen. There shouldn't be rewards for that. There should be penalties. There are people in elected office that are designing their careers around saying outrageous stuff on the cable news network, not to serve people as a congressman, but to get a new job maybe on Fox or MSNBC. And the more outrageous things they say, I guess the better their career building takes place. That should be penalized. We need to resist fake news, which is hard to do these days, Don't let your head explode before you get all the facts. There used to be editors in terms of information. They're gone. Now you have to be your own curator, as the new terminology exists. So don't assume that what you read is true. I'll tell you a quick story. Down the road a bit, I gave a speech at Yale, and I said that after I lost in South Carolina, I went home, slept with my wife of 43 years, which is always good, and even my children. Well, this is really getting to the point of what happened, actually. And even my children loved me. Now, the crowd heard that, and they thought I was attacking President Trump, which wasn't true. So I sensed it, and I said, no, I'm not joking. That's exactly how I felt. So I finished my speech. The next day, the Yale Daily News reports that I attacked President Trump, saying that, you know, his children didn't love him, which there's a lot of things to complain about President Trump. I don't think, but that's one of them, to be honest with you. I think his children do love him, and so I'm flying back home to Miami, and the first thing I see when I land, and my phone's working, is Eric Trump just called me something. Donald Trump Jr. just called me something. Melania, you know, drilled me a new one. And they were legitimately defending their dad and showing their loyalty to their dad. God bless them for it. But I didn't say what they thought I said. So within 24 hours, because of a university newspaper and no editors, this was spread across the world, not just the United States. So we called the editor of the Yale Daily News, and she heard the transcript. She said, "You're right. You didn't say that. I apologize, and we'll retract it." No major newspaper would have probably done that, by the way, or CNN. You know, they would have just let it stay out there in the ether. But the net effect of the damage is done. You can't assume what you read anymore is accurate. You have to become the curator of your own news and decipher out the fake news. We need to acquire news from sources that don't, you know, outside of our own comfort zone. I'm a conservative, so I wake up in the morning, I generally read, just to kind of, you know, get my juices going, I read the Wall Street Journal editorial page. It's the one little sanctuary for a conservative still left. And I'm sure people on the left, I asked students today what they read, and most of the kids were reading the New York Times. Great. My suggestion, and I read the New York Times because I forced myself to. And you should force yourself to read, if you're a liberal, read the Wall Street Journal editorial page. What you'll find is, over time, you'll get a sense that you don't agree with them, but you don't think bad things about them. You don't think that their motives are wrong. The simple fact is, a liberal is different than a conservative, but they still love their country. They still are motivated for the same purpose. We got to get way beyond the belief that somehow someone that doesn't agree with you is wrong. Every time you get your own views validated, you become more righteous about your own views, but worse yet, you become less tolerant about other people's views. How in the heck are we going to deal with the big challenges in our country unless we resist that at all costs? The final thing I'd suggest is there need to be rewards for politicians that do the courageous thing, that challenge based on conviction, not on politics, to challenge their own base if they think it's the right thing to do. And there's so many examples in American history where this is the case. But today, I think people see their shadow. They're worried about being primaried. They're concerned that if they take a courageous stand, that there won't be a positive outcome. Think of Lincoln appointing the team of rivals. Do you think that would have ever happened in modern political time, where 4 candidates that ran against him and disparaged him in ways that makes the current political environment look pretty tepid? He appoints them, and the Union is saved because of the courageous nature of Abraham Lincoln and the team that he developed. How about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, where the Senate effectively was gridlocked and the Southern conservatives did not want to do anything that Lyndon Johnson proposed, and he was actually part of that caucus, if you will. And through his courage, he created the most significant legislation with Republican support, civil rights legislation in American history. How about the surge, converting a bad situation in Iraq where no Republicans and very few Democrats, calls for impeachment took place. David Petraeus, my brother, and John McCain were kind of the last 3 guys standing. It worked. And it took a lot of courage to do it, and there was a huge political price to do it. How about supporting the candidates that do the Nixon to China deal, where only a conservative advocating a particular point of view can get something done, or only a liberal that challenges their orthodoxy on their side can get something done. Or Reagan and Tip O'Neill forging consensus on reforming Social Security and sustaining it for more than a generation of time. How about my dad's budget deal in 1991, where he lost his election in 1992 after having a 90% approval rating because he violated a pledge of no new taxes, but he created a structure that ended up creating the first budget surpluses since in the post-World War II era. This is the kind of politics that we need to have. It happens at the local level, it happens at the state level. We need for it to happen again in Washington. The next generation, you all, are going to be the ones that ultimately change our culture, and hopefully along the way you'll change this poisonous political environment as well. I hope you rise up and stand on principle that decency and honor and consensus orientation is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of American strength. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
How long did I go? Too long?
No, you're fine. I will limit my questions to preserve time for questions from the audience, but I do have a few things that I wanted to talk to you about. You made some really interesting points about sort of investments, demographic change, people 65 and older, and investments in older people squeezing out investments in younger people. And you know, I know in this state, what we're spending on health care, which is primarily going to older people, is really putting a lot of pressure on the state budget for investing in education and young people. Did you face that in Florida? What do you think about
We did. I
healthcare
mean,
reform?
Medicare is 100% federal,
No,
but
Medicaid,
Medicaid, which is the fastest growing part of the budget, crowds out everything else. The two, and so lifting people out of poverty and giving a chance for people to live purposeful lives independent of government would lessen those demands for sure, and reforming how Medicaid works and growing the economy for everybody to benefit is the way that you suppress the costs for the elderly principally and open up opportunities to invest in long-term things. And certainly K-12 education is one of those, higher education, which is what gets cut first and foremost. Whenever there's a downturn, the university budgets, at least in our state, most states gets this first in line. K-12 is probably next. And Medicaid, because it's an entitlement and has all sorts of federal rules, you can't cut per se, and you don't want to cut. You want to grow your economy and give people a chance to make these decisions themselves rather than be in a government subsidized insurance plan. But it is a huge very inefficient insurance system. We did some innovative things, but they really are on the margin. And the Medicaid budget today, compared to when I was there in any state, has grown to the point where it's probably close to 50% of the general revenue of every state budget.
Right. Yeah.
Which is, it used to be 10%, 30 years ago. Now it's 50%.
Yeah. So let me come back to one more specific aspect of immigration, which you spoke about, and that is DACA.
Yeah.
So, major interest to universities. We have DACA students here, and we're trying our best to support them, but here they are in a situation where only a federal injunction is keeping the program alive. And there doesn't look like there's any hope on the horizon for a legislative solution. I mean, so I guess what would you say to them? I'm sure there's some of them here, but also how do you think about getting to a good answer?
This is like Groundhog's Day. If we can't get this done right with 75% approval, of American people, then the harder immigration issues will never happen. This has broad support among Republicans and Democrats, obviously, but it's a political wedge issue. And the president one day says he's for solving the DACA issue, the next day he changes his mind. And I think part of what Washington needs to do is Congress needs to start doing its work irrespective of who's in the White House and start giving stuff to the White House to either accept or reject. It makes no sense to me. Someone who came to this country under the age of 16 through no fault of their own should be treated humanely. And the potential of those young people who know, most of them don't know any, they know very little about their country of origin. Their potential to make a difference by bringing permanent status to their situation, I would argue a path to citizenship, would unleash a lot of economic opportunities. And morally, it's just and right. So I agree with you. I mean, I'm not optimistic about this, but even when people agree, they can't agree. That's just bizarre. If you think about it, I mean, I don't want to bring it, just try to take away all the political gibberish around this. Do you know anybody that disagrees that a so-called dreamer shouldn't be allowed a process to earn citizenship? I've not met one in political life in Congress. They're all for it. And then they all have their little caveats, you know. So back in the day, you'd say, okay, better border security for solving this problem for, I wouldn't just say DACA recipients, I'd say all people in that category, because roughly half of the so-called dreamers have, have applied. The other half, it's a broader universe.
Right, right.
And, look, I mean, I live in Miami.
Yeah.
This, half the people born, 60%, I think, of Miami-Dade County residents were born in another country. There's nothing like it.
Yeah.
It's why I live there. It's why I may not be the right person to have the full perspective of why people are so anxious about these immigration issues. I sleep with one. My children are Mexican-American. My daughter-in-law, that's okay, you got it, it's supposed to be a joke. My daughter-in-law is from Canada. Her parents are from Iraq. My granddaughter is a quadra-hyphenated American. She's a Canadian, Iraqi, Texas, Mexican, American. Texan being a national nationality, as you know. So for me, my life experience is different perhaps than people that feel threatened by immigration. I find it to be vital, important, and it's added an incredible vitality to my life personally. So I'm probably not the right guy to ask.
Yeah. So let me ask you about one controversial issue that you didn't discuss in your talk, and that is about same-sex marriage. And in Reply All, which is a memoir chronicling your time as governor, you recount an email exchange you had with a gay friend who was, I think, upset about your support of a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. But I think your views have really changed. Yeah, the outlawing. Maybe I got that wrong. Other way around. But I think my impression is that your views have maybe changed over time somewhat. And could you talk about that?
Well, yeah, sure. It's I've never felt like it's appropriate to discriminate against people, whether it's their sexual orientation or any other way. I do believe that traditional marriage is important for our country's success, and I don't find a contradiction in that. This crazy thing called the Constitution, though, and the Supreme Court ruling has intervened between whatever I said there and now, which is it's now a constitutional right, and it's time to move on. Here's a subject that may invoke some controversy, though. Religious freedom is also guaranteed in the Constitution, and this university was founded on the very tenets of that, something that everybody here should be really proud of. And there needs to be, in a big, generous country, there needs to be the ability to protect religious freedom. I'm a Catholic, and as a Catholic, we believe in the sanctity of marriage between a man and a woman. As a Catholic, we believe that life begins at conception, and it should be protected till the very end. These are deeply held beliefs that I have and many other people, and it seems that there should be an accommodation for people of faith, as well as protecting people's civil liberties and their rights in this country. And I think we can find common ground on that.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. So one last question before I open it, and that is just advice to students. I know so many students who I think they're passionate about policy issues, international policy, domestic policy. Right now, they are completely turned off by politics, right? And so much so that, it's affecting people's career choices. Like, why would I want to go to Washington when I graduate? Why would I want to do that? Yep. And how do you persuade people that this is, or maybe you don't, that this is something that, I believe that we need young people going into policy and politics.
Well, but I would, first of all, I'd say if you're interested in foreign policy, you got to go to Washington.
Yeah.
And I would encourage you to do so for sure. But if you're interested in policy making or solving problems or taking an idea and converting it so that for the betterment of people that you care for, your neighbors, your fellow citizens, or whatever it is, then that motivation can be fulfilled outside of Washington, perhaps much more effectively. State government is a place to hang your hat for sure. But out of government, I mean, the world we're in today, why do we always outsource our compassion or our desire to see a problem solved through government? Think of all the things that can be done through, this may sound trivial, through GoFundMe. I mean, the things that you can do to make a difference and mobilize support in a cause is radically different today than it was just a decade ago. And it's going to be even more so. So engagement is really the issue at hand. And I don't think we should discourage people young people to get involved in government and serve in public service. But I don't think the default should be Washington, D.C. The opportunities there are narrow, by the way, because the workforce, the federal government workforce, these people are hanging on for dear life. They're all in their 50s and 60s. They got really cushy jobs in terms of the benefits. They're not necessarily saying, oh, young person, look, you're a well-qualified person. I will give up my job so you can take it. That's not happening. But at the state level and local level, there's a lot more dynamic kind of chance for young people to truly make a difference.
Thank you. So let's open the floor to questions. We have microphones on both sides, so if people want to come and we'll go back and forth, so doesn't matter which side you go on. And let's start right here. Thank you. Can you say who you are? If you don't mind?
My name's James. I'm a sophomore here. I'm a little hoarse. Forgive me. Governor, I want to offer my condolences and to thank you so much for coming here today and giving what I think we all thought was a very well-reasoned and well-researched speech, which is something you rarely hear anymore, so we appreciate that. I just have a simple question. Based on a year and a half of evidence, do you believe that Donald J. Trump is qualified to be president?
I believe he won fair and square. He was elected President of the United States, and I'm not a big fan of how he behaves in the office, if you will. I don't think he's a role model for people. In the day, you would always say, you know, if you work hard and play by the rules, you can be just like him. Eventually, it'll be just like her. You know, the president is the prime minister and king or queen of our country. There's a symbolism there that I don't think he fills the space appropriately. So, having said that, he was elected. And there's a tradition in our country to hope and pray that the president succeeds because everybody benefits, and that's my hope. I know, you know, whether he's qualified or not is not really the issue at hand.
Well, do you believe that if he succeeds in his current policy track, that that's good for the country?
It would be, well, if there's high sustained economic growth, if we can grow at 3.5%, and there's rising income for middle class, which is happening at least temporarily, that's a good thing. If he could find some way to turn the dynamics of the Korean Peninsula upside down to create the possibility of a denuclearization of the peninsula, that's a really good thing. There are things that are work in progress, and if he succeeds, I, for one, not being a big fan of his, will applaud him. And that distinguishes me from a whole lot of people who basically need therapy every time the guy's name comes up. Never Trumpers need to give, you know, look, you got to give him credit when things that you believe are the right thing to do, that he's doing them. And I think that gives you a little bit of leeway of being critical when he does things that you don't agree with as well.
Thank you. So over here, please.
My name's Nick. I'd also like to thank you very much, Governor Bush, for coming. You hinted at this a little bit. To what extent did rhetoric and language play a role in the presidential election, and what did you learn rhetorically from running?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I learned that my rhetoric stunk, I guess. For starters, you know, like, I wish I learned that a little earlier, but, you know, I talked about this in the eulogy of my mom, that when you're brought up a certain way, the habits that are formed, the first teacher of a child, basically, the more effective you are is when you're consistently saying certain things are right. And my mom was an incredible teacher in that regard. But one of the problems of that is that rhetorically, in this highly charged environment, anytime that I felt like I was, to try to connect with people's angst and their gut, there was a high probability that I would have violated my first teacher's words to me. And I can tell you, there's like a visceral feeling of a looming presence of my mother about ready to whack me across the head. So on the debate where people would say, I'm not kidding, outrageous, stupid stuff that they knew for a fact was not accurate, but they said it to appeal to people, it just wasn't in my DNA to do it. And so from that perspective, I was a pretty lousy candidate. And I was surprised, frankly, that there were rewards for some of the things that were said. And hopefully we'll purge that from our system, because the net effect of that is that someone who has an idea to solve a problem is not going to be in positions of responsibility until we get beyond basically politicians preying our fears or our angst or attacking somebody else to make yourself look better, all that stuff that your mom taught you not to do. Somehow we need to inject that back in politics, that you can have a lively conversation about ideas, and where you disagree, you can be principled about it, but you can't have a climate of disparagement and expect someone then to say, after you've just drilled them as bad as you can, then say, oh, well, let's get together and have a drink and solve this problem. It just doesn't work that way. Human nature is not designed for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over here, please.
Hi, my name's Alana. I'm not affiliated with Brown University. I do clinical pediatric cancer research at Hasbro Children's Hospital, which is just down the street. About 35% of my patients at the time of their diagnosis are on Medicaid. And 6 months into treatment, that number jumps to about 80 or 90% because the costs of their treatment are so unbelievably staggering. And a lot of them end up paying for a lot of their chemotherapy using GoFundMe.
In what?
GoFundMe. So I don't really agree with your assertion that GoFundMe is, and other things like that, are kind of an adequate substitute for these social safety nets. And my boyfriend and I were having this really interesting conversation yesterday about how some countries like Norway and Finland have these really robust social programs that are funded by the government, whereas other countries, such as Malaysia, have these very strong cultural connections where people are able to rely on families, and in that sense, they have a social insurance that is simply someone's community and family and religious group, so on and so forth. But the problem in the US is that we have neither. So while I do agree with some of the points you made about the importance of family, the problem is that I don't really see that as the primary thing. We can't refuse to have these social programs in a wealthy country such as ours, where we have so much money to fund a military, and say that people should be able to defend on GoFundMe and depend on these forms of social insurance as opposed to government types of programs, which have proven to be very successful.
Do you have a question, or you just want a reaction? I mean, either one is fine, but...
Yeah, so I was wondering, where do you see kind of that connection between this type of social insurance depending on friends and family versus government?
So thank you, thanks. And thanks for the job you do.
Yeah.
First of all, I didn't say that GoFundMe is supplanting Medicaid, Medicare, and the social safety net, just for the record, in case someone wants to tweet that out, and then I have to deal with it. In terms of engagement in causes, there are new means of gathering support for causes that didn't exist just a decade ago. That was the point. It could be environmental policy, it could be education policy, it could be all sorts of things that where you organize in a different way, and it doesn't rely on government to be the solution to it. As it relates to Medicaid, interestingly, and Medicare, the two biggest programs, we spend more on our healthcare system than Norway and Finland. You know, the idea that somehow we're not spending on this is really not true. It's close to $1 trillion of healthcare spending through government right now. If you take Obamacare, Medicaid, Medicare, S-CHIP, all of these combined, it's over $1 trillion. It's a lot of money. We have about $1 trillion deficit that helps sustain this spending. The problem with it is it's not being spent efficiently at all, and it's not focused on the things that you would want it to have. For example, there's very little healthcare insurance reimbursement for prevention. There's a lot of ways to avoid having these acute diseases that cascade into healthcare providers' lives, like the organization you work for, that could have been solved by preventing the illness to begin with. Yet our whole system is basically reacting to disease rather than rewarding health. Spending a little bit more on focusing on prevention could do a lot, I think, to make sure that, that these costs go down and access to care goes up. The final thing I'd say is I don't think it has to be either or. I do think that strong family life, in whatever form it takes, I'm not suggesting any particular form here, but families matter, and you can have both. You can have a social safety net that is adequately funded by government and family life that is vibrant, that can help take care of people in their time of need. Yep.
Hi, my name is Colleen. I just want to thank you for coming today, and I'm so sorry about your mom passing away. She seemed like a really lovely person. I grew up Catholic, and so I grew up a lot hearing, you know, like the idea of, you know, traditional marriage isn't between a man and a man or a woman and a woman or people that, you know, don't identify in the binary system. And so I've heard that even from my own family. And what my question is how do you think same-sex marriage has the potential to infringe upon people practicing their religion freely? Where do you see a danger in that?
I don't. I don't see a danger to people that believe in traditional marriage having their belief be infringed upon by people that don't believe in that. I don't. But I do believe a society, if you're a tolerant, diverse society, and if you believe the teachings of Jesus and of the Bible, and if you're an adherent to a particular faith, mine is, as I said, is Catholic, that I should have the right to have that view. And I should have the right to organize my life around my faith. And I believe that, as I said, that there are constitutional protections for same-sex marriage. There should not be discrimination. But also people that believe like I do, and there are quite a few of them, by the way. In fact, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the views that I expressed were the views of Barack Obama. I mean, this is changing at a pretty fast pace here. There are very few elected officials that would have a differing view than what I've expressed here tonight. And I want to make sure that people that have those views are also constitutionally protected.
I guess I'm sorry. I just guess my question is how could they not be constitutionally protected?
Well, if you're a baker and you don't want to participate in a same-sex marriage, and you don't want to provide the cake for that marriage, you should not be forced by the state to do so because it goes against your religious conscience. That would be one example, among many.
A current
examples.
case.
Huh?
A current
A
case.
current case in front of the Supreme Court. Now, if you're a baker and someone walks in and they say, I'm gay, I'd like to buy a loaf of bread, and you say no, then that's discrimination. And we should enforce the laws of discrimination. There's a big difference between participating in a ceremony that goes against your religious experience and discriminating against someone because they have a different point of view than you have. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Thank you. Question here.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Lauren. I want to also thank you so much for coming. In your speech, you briefly mentioned that American families are having children later on in life and having less children. And that, in contrast, is that's kind of generally the reverse that we see for immigrant families, are having more children at younger ages. And I was wondering if the education level and the low economic status that we see among immigrant women, does that factor into the age that women are having children? And what are the factors that determine the access to abortion in this country? So I was wondering what your response was on the possibility that immigrant families who may be low income and having low education levels, are they having children earlier because they don't even have the option to access abortion due to the financial costs and access to health care? And does that put them in, to having children, does that put them in more economic hardship?
The data that I've seen suggests that immigrant families believe family is important. It's a you know, a safety net to come from a far-off land to come to the country. It provides 2 incomes rather than 1. It provides a solidarity with where they came from, and having children is a value that they believe in. I don't believe it's a question of poverty. In fact, legal immigrants end up attaining higher income levels based on the data that I've seen than native-born Americans. Now, undocumented workers, I've not seen the statistics. There you may have a point. I just don't know.
Hi, I'd like to thank you again so much for coming.
You guys are way too polite.
So I'm Aria, and I'm actually a product of the public education system in Florida. And I had a couple questions about your speech on the aspects of social mobility as well as education. So growing up, like a lot of other 4th and 5th graders, I sat through the FCAT, and then I watched my little brother go through the same thing. And as time went on, there were more and more standardized tests, and it became that the teachers were teaching towards the test rather than teaching the material. And additionally, I completely agree with you. A parent's choice and informing them as consumers is incredibly important. But as I grew up, what tended to happen was people that were already low income or disadvantaged would drop out of the blue ribbon schools, and then those with the money or the privilege to choose to send their kids to better schools would be able to. In addition to kind of just the bureaucracy around the standardized testing that formed, I guess my question is, how do you balance the fact that you want to give parents these choices and you don't want to create more of a bureaucracy, but at the same time, the method of evaluating schools inherently does that and to a certain extent causes teachers to teach to exams rather than teaching the material?
Great point. First of all, I'm going to shamelessly take credit for your education and got you into Brown. Actually, I feel the looming presence of my mother again. That's incorrect. You earned it through your hard work. See how it's hard to be in public life with this problem I have. Teachers shouldn't teach to the test. They should teach to the standards. There should be fewer tests. The tests ought to be diagnostic as well as an assessment of how schools and teachers are doing about student learning. The information should get back. The test should be later in the year rather than, in our case, the test was in March, which meant that the last 3 months were kind of, I don't know if you saw a lot of videos and stuff, but it was less important after the test, So an accountability system that is more effective would be the testing is fewer times. There's not the rote kind of activity that determines the outcome. You can't teach to standards, and great teachers don't teach to the test. The district and the principals do create this system around it, and it should change. But accountability really matters, particularly for low-income kids, and this is where I disagree with you. The data suggests that low-income kids in Florida are the best in the country in terms of the NAEP, which is the nation's report card that you can't teach to. It's not a test that you study for. It's a test that measures real-world proficiency in 12th grade and 8th grade reading and 8th grade math. And in that particular case, the kids that have done the best in Florida are low-income kids, kids with learning disabilities, Hispanics, and African Americans, where we're in top 10 in each one of those categories. We're middling down the road amongst kids that are not in those categories. So the accountability system really did matter because, I'll give you an example. When I ran for governor in 1998, I went to visit 250 schools. It's a lot of schools in a year when schools aren't open in the summer. And I remember seeing a kid that was practicing, was in a lab in the back of Seminole High School in Orange County or Seminole County north of Orlando. He was preparing for a test that would be the last time that he could take it, and it was an 8th grade level aptitude test to graduate from high school. That's where it was in 1998. 8th grade level test, butts in a seat, you're going to go, you graduate. And this kid could not answer the following question. A baseball game starts at 3 and ends at 4:30. How long's the game? He was a senior, and he'd been in the K-12 system the entire time. I mean, if you don't put accountability on a school system, the net result is the kids that can achieve and do great things are going to do well. The kids that are struggling are the ones that are left behind. And the results suggest in Florida that the kids that were left behind now have a fighting chance. In fact, 250,000 more children are grade level readers because of the change in the system that was controversial, and everybody was told you're going to get acne if you take the FCAT, and the world's coming to an end. And it's not perfect, but it yielded learning gains that put us from the very bottom up to now a role model for many other states.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have our standard problem, which is we have run out of time and we have more questions than we have time for. So what I'm going to ask is just the two students in the front of each line, maybe just both say, both say your questions one after another, and then you can wrap up with both of them. Okay, so please go ahead.
Yeah,
for the others.
Mr. Bush, I'm Colin. My question is about the balance between rhetoric or personality and policy. Everyone's talked a lot about Donald Trump and his tone and demeanor, which are obviously egregious and important to note. President Paxson herself mentioned the value of dignity and grace at your mother's funeral, words which contrast frequent coverage of Trump's degradation of the presidential office. But I'm interested in how different his comments about Mexicans being rapists and murderers are from other conservative presidential candidates' comparable immigration policies, or how we weigh Obama's charisma and honor against his unilateral assassination of suspected terrorists, which I personally oppose and others might not. Or finally, how we differentiate you, someone who opposes women's reproductive rights, cuts taxes, supports the death penalty, supports private education and privatizing healthcare, and is skeptical of climate change, from Donald Trump on these issues other than tone, and how much that difference should really matter.
That's not a wrap-up kind of question. But let's get the other one.
It does matter. It matters a lot. It matters because as governor of the state, I accomplished a lot of things because I didn't disparage people. I persuaded people. You may not agree with anything that I did or I believe, but I was open about it in a way. My tone was not judgmental about someone that disagreed with me. Look, I don't even know who you are. I don't think you're a bad person, though. And you might think I'm a bad person, but you're going to have to get over it. Because when you're in a public leadership position, you have to stand on conviction and believe what you believe and persuade people towards your beliefs rather than do what other politicians are doing now, which is disparage someone, push them down, and make yourself look better without any substance behind it. So I think there is a big difference, and this political environment that we have today is dangerous. And it's on the left and right, by the way. It's not just, I know everybody obsesses about the current occupant of the White House. This is a problem that goes beyond that. Thank you for asking the question.
Thank you.
Or making the comment, I think that's probably a better way of saying it.
That was a good question.
Hi, my name is Srishti, and I really appreciate you taking the time to answer our questions. So my question is about gun control / gun reform. So how has your views changed about that after the tragic Parkland shooting and after the Brave students have come out and tried to achieve change?
So that's a great question. I'd say my views have changed because I now have information that, frankly, I didn't know, which is that someone the age of 18 could buy a rifle. I thought because the age for pistols in the state of Florida in most places is 21. So changing that made sense. This idea of bump stocks, which turn a semi-automatic weapon that's used for recreational purposes, even for hunting and other things, into a quasi-automatic weapon, is inappropriate. And with that information, I supported the legislature's efforts to ban those. I think part of the challenge that we face right now in this world where people really feel isolated is increasingly so. This may be anecdotal, but it just feels this way for me, that when we're not connected with one another in our communities, in our families. This young man had the loss of his family, was in a aunt's, uncle's home, had spiraled out of control. The school knew it. His friends knew it. He put pictures of himself hurting himself on the internet, which is a leading indication of potential violent behavior. His brother knew it, and the DCF, the Department of Children and Families, knew it because there were calls to him. The FBI knew it. The whole adult ecosystem around this young man knew that this kid was a huge potential threat, and the whole system let them down. And so I think there has to be more appropriate laws as it relates to when you can identify someone's problem, similar to what we do with Baker Acting. I don't know if you follow that, but when someone has severe mental health challenges, you can put them in a place where they can't hurt themselves or hurt others. And someone who has access to weapons ought to be part of that as well. The Florida legislature invested, thanks to the efforts of these young kids that made a very compelling, articulate case, $400 million to deal with these mental health challenges and to connect people when they're spiraling out of control to society. And I think those are really good steps. Not every crime can be avoided, but in Florida, as in most parts of the country, violent crime is significantly down. Gun violence in Florida is dramatically down, like 75% down over the last 40 years. So in this environment, we do have these isolated cases that are incredibly tragic, and I think it requires more connection inside of our own communities. Back to the idea of a bottom-up approach. I know everybody wants to have a 5-point plan in Washington to solve these things, and it's better for us, I think, to engage first and foremost at the local level to be able to deal with it. Great question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry we couldn't get all the questions. Please join me in thanking Jeb Bush. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.